Today, we're going to settle one of Terraria's biggest questions. Is the Crimson or Corruption better? And of course, we're going to do this the only way I know how, with science! And for the sake of this video, we'll just pretend my opinion is science itself. But this is going to be the most comprehensive look at the debate between which evil you should choose for your world. We're going to rank everything, and I mean everything, and every time one side proves superior to the other, it will earn a point. We're going to look at bosses, drops, enemies, weapons, ease of navigation, and so much more to determine our winner. So let's get into it. With how much we're going to examine today, we'll need to break things apart. So first, let's take a look at Prehard Mode and what happens when you first encounter the biome. Which one is going to give you a harder time? For our purposes, we're going to assume you're not a masochist and want things to be more difficult, so points will be rewarded in this video to whichever biome proves to be easiest to handle in whatever situation requires there to be a difficulty scale, I guess. With that in mind, when it comes to the enemies of either biome, the clear winner for easiest falls on the Corruption. Eaters of Souls are just so susceptible to knockback that even your starting copper short sword will keep all of them away no problem with the right amount of patience. The worms can be an issue, but they aren't common enough to place them above the Crimson. Base monsters, blood crawlers, and Chimera are the three enemies you'll encounter here, and each of them has their own way of, well, getting around them. They would also appear to be more resistant to knockback, but the fact that they don't float prevents you from punching them upwards and then sneaking around them like you can do with Eaters of Souls. On the other hand, there is navigation. Part of the problem with the Corruption is how you will almost certainly need to bridge over many of its chasms. Being slowed down like this can lead to being overwhelmed by Eaters of Souls. Crimson, on the other hand, is a relatively easy place to navigate, with some of the Crimson tunnels spawning strangely high from time to time, which can be just as big an issue, but generally speaking, the Crimson will be easier for you to cross than the Corruption. Navigation also has 2 more points to attribute. What happens if you want to break a Shadow Orb or a Heart? Well, in the Corruption, you can easily jump down and get to Shadow Orbs with little threat from enemies. This does, however, come with the risk of jumping down the wrong chasm and dying to fall damage, and even if it's the right one, you face the general risk of dying to fall damage. Meanwhile, the Crimson has safe slopes for you to run down, with the only issue being the enemies becoming a bit of a bigger problem. So I'm giving the Corruption 1 point for enemies not being an issue, but also a point to the Crimson for largely removing the fear of falling to your death. And let's take another look at those enemies, shall we? For the Corruption, we have Eaters of Souls and Devourers, otherwise known as Big Worms. The Crimson, meanwhile, has face monsters, Chimera, and blood crawlers. Regardless of how dangerous each of these are, we are going to give another point to the Crimson for its enemy variety. While the Corruption largely places one enemy in your path, the Crimson will mix things up with more enemies that all work differently. Perhaps that makes the biome harder to survive, but I guess we'll still reward it another point for variety. Now, while you're down there, you will find yourself at some point breaking a Crimson Heart or Shadow Orb. What drops are available to you from these orbs? Well, first, the melee weapon drops. Either you will be rewarded with a Ball of Hurt for the Corruption or the Rotted Fork for the Crimson. Both of these are more niche weapon types, and generally speaking, swords are the most commonly used weapon. That's not to say that these are useless, far from it. In fact, it seems as though each of them were designed with its prospective evil boss in mind. Flails work pretty well against worms and are best suited for enemies low to the ground. The Ball of Hurt would be terrible against the brain, so the Crimson gets you a spear with its greater reach, allowing you to better hit the brain from a distance while also having good enough piercing to deal with the creepers. That makes the weapons a toss-up until you consider how they'd be used for anything other than bosses. Flails can work, but as mentioned, they will struggle much more with enemies that are not earthbound, and what else do you find in the Corruption? A bunch of flying enemies. The Rotted Fork is the clear winner for its greater general utility. Oh wait, I just realized I forgot the first guaranteed drop from these things. The Musket or Undertaker. This one is pretty easy. The Musket is the better one. Sure, there is some give and take with the Undertaker being the faster weapon, while the Musket does more damage. I could make an argument for why the Musket is a better weapon in some technical way in the game, but that doesn't matter to me, because one of them is a musket and the other one is not, and I'm American. Onto the mage weapon drop, either the Crimson Cloud or the Vile Thorn. These two are a little hard to compare. The Vile Thorn is a wonderful mage utility weapon that can do wonders against the Eater of Worlds. It won't be any good against any boss after that, but because it can go through walls, the Vile Thorn is wonderful for killing enemies from the safety of a little box, and its piercing makes it suitable against hordes of enemies. The Crimson Rod does not have any use as a primary weapon like the Vile Thorn does. Being a downgraded Nimbus Rod, the Crimson Rod places one cloud and rains damage on your foes, allowing you to use another weapon with free extra damage on the side. Generally speaking, this is most useful against bosses and events because there isn't much of a point in placing a cloud to kill 1 or 2 enemies. It can also be very hard to use underground. I know when I play Crimson Worlds, I rarely find myself using the Crimson Cloud, and overall, I do believe it's lesser than the Vile Thorn, and so another point to the corruption. What about the accessory? Well, this seems pretty straightforward. Either Panic Necklace or Band of Star Power. Panic Necklace can be a great utility accessory for any class, giving you a boost in speed after taking damage, helping you avoid being juggled by enemies. You can have that or 20 extra mana. Yeah, that's pretty sad. Only mage benefits, and not even by much. You can at least combine it with the Band of Regeneration, but that does not salvage the Band of Star Power. And finally, the light pet, Shadow Orb versus Crimson Heart. And well, I'm not even going to pretend that there's zero bias here. The Shadow Orb wins every day of the week. I actually actively throw away the Crimson Heart or sell it off as soon as I have the chance. I'd rather not have a light pet than have this pulsating, bleeding heart following me everywhere. My best, more objective argument is that the Shadow Orb provides more consistent lights and follows you in a more clean pattern, but that doesn't matter to me at all. The Crimson Heart is gross. So the Corruption and Crimson are tied once again, and you might be tempted to think I'm keeping the scores close on purpose for the sake of, video things, but no, I actually went into this with zero planning, so we're just going to see where things line up. Next up are our Expert and Master Mode drops. There's the Worm Scarf, increasing damage reduction by a whopping 17%, and the Brain of Confusion that has two functions. Most famously, it's known for being one of the 2 items that gives you a dodge chance. Also of note is that it can confuse your enemies. I was actually shocked when researching this little bit on the Brain of Confusion because there's a lot more to it than you might think. Turns out the base chance of inflicting the Confuse debuff is 60%, and the chance increases by 0.4% per point of damage, meaning if you take 100 or more damage, you're guaranteed to inflict confusion on your foe. The more secretive ability the brain has involves its dodge chance. See, you get a 1 in 6 shot of dodging an attack, and if you do dodge, then you receive a Cerebral Mind Trick debuff for 4 seconds. This debuff prevents you from dodging again and again and again for 4 seconds, but it also increases critical strike and summon damage by 10%. The issue with comparing these, though, is that the perceptible difference is obvious. If you wear the Worm Scarf, you likely will forget it's even equipped, as its effects are more or less hidden, while the Brain's 2 main effects are both very obvious. You'll notice a dodge, and you'll notice when enemies are confused. For this reason, I think it's a bit tough to properly compare the two, but I want to have to give the point to the Crimson. Its varied and unique effects would seem to be a lot more helpful for more people. That's not it for bosses, however. There's still a matter of the, Master Mode pets. The Brain Spider for the Brain in a Jar, or the Floating Worm from Writhing Remains. Once again, I will actively sell off the Brain in a Jar. A spider brain is gross. If you like it, you are gross. Everything is gross. A flying worm, on the other hand, is just sort of neat. Point to the Corruption. There is actually a non-Master Mode pet. You can also get either the Eater's Bone or Bone Rattle. Another point to the Corruption. I don't want no face monster following me, although the flying animation is kind of cute. But let's jump into the ores and everything involved in that. First, the ore itself. You might not think it, but I know some of you more knowledgeable Terrarians already have this in mind. Crimson ore actually sells for a higher price than Demonite. Neither is harder to find naturally generated, as far as I'm aware, and neither are harder to mine, so the higher sell price gives the Crimson a point. Never know when you'll need the extra cash. But let's think about what the ore, or more precisely, the bars, can craft. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to pay attention to everything like hammers and axes, but then I found some interesting comparisons, so they're getting thrown in right now. The Blood Cluster Axe deals 2 more damage, but is also slower. I don't feel like calculating the DPS, as nobody uses these as weapons, and so point to the Corruption for the faster axe. I was going to give a point to the Corruption again for the exact same reason for the hammer, as it deals 1 more damage until I took a closer look at use time. Both are very slow, but the Crimson one is 5 points faster because the lower numbers mean faster use time, and so point to the Crimson for the faster hammer. When it comes to fishing poles, Relogic didn't even try to balance these things out. The Flesh Catcher is objectively better, and it also even sells for more. I'm not the most knowledgeable on yo-yos, so I can't say for sure whether my brief analysis of them properly compared the two. The Artery would appear to do more damage, but does have less knockback. Not sure how much knockback really matters for yo-yos though, and I didn't notice any other differences, so I'm giving the point to the Crimson. Pickaxes were interesting, with the Deathbringer pickaxe dealing more damage and having greater knockback, but the Nightmare pickaxe is ever so slightly faster. And when it comes to pickaxes, all anybody cares about is speed. And that's just about everything you probably weren't thinking I'd compare, other than the fact that the Crimson has 1 more crafting recipe than the Corruption. Crimson gets to craft the meatball. So the weapon distinction from the orbs between the ball of hurt and the spear becomes entirely meaningless once the evil boss is defeated, as you can get either a spear or flail on the Crimson world, but are stuck spearless in the Corruption. Does anybody care? No, but now I know this little fact and demand a demonized spear be added into the game. At last, let's get to the more interesting comparisons. First, the bows. There's the Demon and Tendon bows. Both of them have the same stats other than the fact that one has a greater use speed and damage per arrow. This comes down to a matter of preference, but it's interesting how the Corruption has the slower gun and faster bow, while Crimson has the faster gun and slower bow. I generally prefer weapons that shoot a lot more and deal less damage in most games, but Terraria is not one of those games. Point to the Crimson. Now, what about the swords? Well, that gets interesting, as the two swords are quite distinct from each other. The Blood Butcher does more damage while being a little slower, but I think the most important point of comparison is the abilities of the swords. The Light's Bane has quite a lot of utility, having a short-range projectile that goes through walls. This gives the Light's Bane a use most melee weapons don't have. Prehard Mode, there is only 2 other melee weapons that go through walls, with those being the Blade of Grass and Star Fury. This would mean that the Light's Bane would have a strength here, but at the same time, if you take a closer look, you realize that it's rendered irrelevant. The Blade of Grass deals more damage while being a larger weapon and having the exact same attack speed. It also benefits from a leafy projectile that is arguably better than the Light's Bane. Demonite can be easier to find, unless the sword might have early game value, but considering how the Blade of Grass and Star Fury can be found around the same time in progression, I question its true worth. What about the Blood Butcher? Its ability is another that is distinct from the rest. It inflicts the Blood Butcher debuff on enemies, with the first strike causing 4 damage to be dealt every second for 9 seconds, stacking up to 5 times, where it deals 180 damage over 9 seconds. This extra damage can be quite helpful, and to the best of my knowledge, there are no bosses that are immune to this debuff, making it useful as a secondary debuffing weapon paired with another sword. But even on its own, the Blood Butcher is a fine weapon. This, I have a feeling, might be my more controversial opinion, but for this reason, I believe the Blood Butcher to be better than the Light's Bane. And that really gives the Crimson its biggest lead yet, and, well, I wonder how long it'll last. The final point of comparison where the craftable ore materials are concerned is the 2 armor sets, Shadow Armor and Crimson Armor. They have the same defensive stat, while Shadow Armor provides an increased 15 critical strike chance and the Crimson gives a 9% increased base damage. Of these 2 options, I think this would give the Shadow Armor a leg up, as base damage means much less when dealing with Prehard Mode's lower damage numbers, not to mention it provides a smaller numeric increase. What about their set bonus though? Shadow Armor provides a whopping 75% increase to acceleration and deacceleration, as well as a 1.15% multiplier to the player's maximum movement speed. Crimson, on the other hand, greatly increases the health regeneration rate that becomes even more effective the longer you avoid damage or by standing still. As for how good this healing is in practice, it can be hard to say, with the effects sometimes being unnoticeable. Although theoretically a decent tank armor, it primarily shines when you are savvy enough to avoid damage, which often isn't how the tank works. That's not to say that the set bonus is bad by any means, only that it's at its best the better you are at the game, or else when you are out of combat. Shadow Armor, meanwhile, provides a constant and tangible change to your capabilities as a player, allowing you to dodge enemies with greater ease while also being able to navigate your world that much easier. Combining Shadow Armor with the Magiluminescence can make you a true speed demon early hard mode, so for that reason the Corruption is going to get the point for the best armor. With that, the Crimson only has a 3-point lead as we head off into hard mode, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who are already counting the Corruption out because of a certain item that can be obtained in the Crimson, but let's just see how competitive these two are. Navigation between the 2 biomes is no longer a factor in hard mode, as the underground evil biome is randomly spawned in caves, making the 2 no different from each other. There is, however, 1 point to be rewarded when it comes to navigation, and that has everything to do with the Demon and Crimson altars. Quite possibly, the single most annoying thing about the Crimson is how hard it can be to break the altars. They are often spread around in random small caves, requiring you to go on a mining journey to break most of them. The Corruption, meanwhile, presents all the demon altars to you on a silver platter, allowing you to speedily break all the altars you need while also forming a massive horde of Wraith friends to loyally follow behind you. You could argue this makes the Crimson safer to deal with and therefore better, but Wraiths are not the most dangerous enemy and are easily knocked back. Either going so fast they can't catch up or pausing periodically to kill a race still makes this task incredibly easy. And the Crimson could even be considered more deadly since the mining really slows you down and allows more dangerous enemies like herplings to spawn. Speaking of, what about the mobs? In Prehard Mode, we awarded a point for being easier to kill and a point for biodiversity. We'll do that here again in Hard Mode. The Corruption won the point in Prehard Mode for being easier, and I think it's pretty safe to award them that point again. You'll face Corruptors, which is just an upgraded version of Eaters of Souls, and also shoots a breakable projectile, and there are a few new slime variants. There was a time that the Corruptors would actually spread the corruption with their projectiles. Pretty sure that was before the Crimson was introduced into the game, and if that was the case, then the Corruption would rightfully be far more feared than the Crimson, but as that's no longer the case, the Corruption doesn't have much of anything to be afraid of. World Feeders can be dangerous, but fall victim to the same thing all worms do: piercing weapons. There are clingers, and those can be dangerous as they go through walls while also not emitting lights, making them a potential danger while mining, but smacking them is all you need to do to prevent them from being a problem. The Crimson, meanwhile, has herplings and ichor stickers, who also make the Crimson much more dangerous. Herplings are fast and resist a good amount of knockback when they are zooming, making a surprise attack from these things fatal. Ichor stickers are the same as clingers in that all you need to do is continuously hit them to prevent them from shooting you, but if you fail to do so for even a split second, you are toast, as their projectile is an order of magnitude faster than the clingers. So whereas you can still dodge the clinger you failed to account for, you're unlikely to evade the ichor sticker. So the Corruption earns a point for being less of a pain, but the Crimson clearly wins for biodiversity. Whereas the Corruption is doing nothing but upgrading its previous enemies and then adding more slimes with a single new unique enemy, the Crimson takes the page of Prehard Mode enemies, rips it up, and starts from scratch, adding the aforementioned herpling and ichor sticker, but also the floaty gross and a new jellyfish and fish variants, and sure enough, a slime. But that gives the Crimson at least 3 entirely unique enemies and then 3 upgraded ones. Let's take a look at hard mode fishing then. There's Hemopiranhas and Eben Koi that stand out the most, and frankly I'm not sure I could say which one is better. The damage or critical strike potion that you can make from them, as I believe it depends on what build you're going for. With that said though, the Corruption will be awarded a point for this because critical strike does not help the summoner, making the Crimson fish useless for their summons. So the Corruption wins simply because it can be helpful for anyone. However, both biomes have a certain second special fish, and this is a little weird to compare. The Crimson gains 2 fish in hard mode, with the Hemopiranha and Crimson Tigerfish, while the Corruption only gains Eben Koi. Meanwhile, back in Prehard Mode, the Corruption has the purple Clubberfish, which cannot be obtained in Crimson Worlds. Comparing these two is a little odd, the Tigerfish and Clubberfish, but they're the second special fish with no other distinct comparison, and I think it's clear which is better. The purple Clubberfish as a weapon is mediocre at best, and is not worth the effort fishing for it unless you're very early game. The Crimson Tigerfish, meanwhile, although not the most helpful, is also the only fish that can craft Heartreach potions, meaning only the Crimson has renewable access to Heartreach, which isn't exactly the most widely used potion, but even a seafood dinner can be useful, whereas the purple Clubberfish is most often useless and sold for money. Then we have the special weapon for each biome, the Blade Tongue and Toxicarp. Of course, this is the most class-dependent difference, and a point would go to the Crimson for anyone running melee and a point to the Corruption for anyone running ranger. But which weapon is better as a whole? It's like comparing apples to oranges, I suppose, but I think there is a clear answer here. The Toxicarp is the better weapon. The reason? It's a more suitable mech weapon than the Blade Tongue. Granted, the melee player does not have a lot of options pre-hard mode, and I argue pre-mech melee is one of the worst classes to be as you are seemingly lacking in options. The Blade Tongue can be useful for its ichor effect as a melee user, but simply drinking an ichor flask will accomplish the same purpose in a much easier way. The Toxicarp, meanwhile, can inflict the poison debuff, and although not what I would choose, it can be quite effective against the mechs, though it might struggle against the Destroyer. I'd say the Blade Tongue is probably more helpful underground, but overall, I think Rangers will benefit more from the Toxicarp than melee users utilizing the Blade Tongue. Oh, and I also just looked at the crate drops from both biomes. Turns out you can get Heartreach potions from both, so the Corruption does technically have a renewable Heartreach potion resource, but the Crimson is keeping the point. One more fishing point to award is for fishing quests. Actually, let's make it 2. The Corruption has 3 quest fish, while Crimson only has 2, so it gets a point there, but I really like the ichor fish, and the cursed fish looks worse than the ichor fish, so we're giving a point to the Crimson for that. That was quick, so another quick point to give is for the fruit you get for shaking trees. Neither is better than the other, but the Rambutan looks the coolest. Also, the Corruption receives a point for being the only world evil with a kite. Now, before we get to the Corruption versus Cursed Flames thing, let's take a look at the biomimics. First, my personal favorite ranger weapon, the dart rifle and pistol. Which of the two is better? The dart rifle does 52 damage while being very slow, while the dart pistol deals 28 damage and is fast. When testing the crystal darts, the dart rifle was able to deal greater damage than the pistol in optimal conditions. How well would this carry over? Practically speaking, well, that depends on how good your aim is, but as I mentioned earlier, I kind of prefer the slightly slower but higher damage weapon, so we're giving the point to the corruption for the better dart weapon. We'll cover dart variants when we get to the Ichor and Cursed Flame discussion. Onto the mage weapon drops, which gives us a little more to consider. The Crimson offers the Life Drain, while the Corruption offers the Clinger Staff. The Life Drain is a pretty good early hard mode mage weapon that can definitely work against the mech bosses. Meanwhile, the Clinger Staff was never really meant to be used as a primary weapon. It's actually kind of fun trying to use it as one, but its purpose is to function as a sort of sentry, allowing you to place it and switch to other weapons. The only drawback of the Clinger Staff is that it requires solid blocks for it to be placed, making it a little finicky for boss arenas. Even so, I think I'm going to have to give the Clinger Staff the point for this because although the Life Drain is great, it's entirely useless to anyone who is not running the mage class, unless you wanted to temporarily use it to boost your life regen. But more people running different classes are likely to find a use for the Clinger Staff, even all the way to the end of the game. For melee weapons, we have the Chain Guillotine and Fatigued Bagnock? How do you pronounce this? Bangcocks. I won't pretend this is a very objective analysis, but the Chain Guillotine wins easily for its range. The Bangcocks, I'm sure, can be really good in the right situation, but the incredibly short range makes them hard to use, particularly against bosses, while the Chain Guillotine provides a solid damage output and enough range to stay away from your target. And the chains are fast enough to actually hit the target consistently. Finally, we have the accessory drop by each of these, and frankly, there is no competition. The Putrid Scent and Flesh Knuckles are your options, and the Flesh Knuckles are the clear runaway winner, providing you with 8 flat defense and being in the recipe for 2 accessories that can be useful to both the summoner and melee classes, though admittedly the melee class benefits the most. Putrid Scent, although it can be used in 3 recipes, not just 2, grants 5% increased critical strike and reduced enemy aggro. Now the Flesh Knuckles increases enemy aggro, but the reason I didn't mention it is because enemy aggro, for all intents and purposes, is a useless stat in single player, at least in my opinion. No matter what I have done to reduce my aggro in any run, I have never felt a noticeable difference in how many or how frequently enemies target me. And it's not like we're trying to do any kind of stealth in Terraria, so why bother with low aggro unless you're in multiplayer? That's the only case it might help, and even then it's no guarantee the boss won't target you anyways. 5% critical strike is fine and all, but the Flesh Knuckles are an obvious winner, especially when you realize that the Putrid Scent's 5% critical strike increase is deleted the moment you combine it with any other accessory, while Flesh Knuckles build upon their other materials, increasing the other accessories' defense. And one last thing to cover before we get to our Ichor and Cursed Flame comparison is the Vampire Knives and Scourge of the Corruptor. These 2 biome chests are wonderful, and the Vampire Knives for a time were absolutely busted. And although there's still a special place in my heart for Vampire Knives, I think the Scourge of the Corruptor has to be declared the winner. It has a greater damage output while also having quite a lot of utility with its homing and crowd control abilities. The Vampire Knives are wonderful for healing, and for that reason it's really hard to say that they're worse than the Scourge of the Corruptor. But overall, I think you're going to find a lot more use for the Scourge of the Corruptor and its greater damage output. Now, seeing the Corruption holding the lead is a change of pace for this video, but I'm fairly certain it's not going to last long as we head into Ichor and Cursed Flames to consider next. Right off the bat, a point has to be rewarded to the Corruption as Cursed Flames are dropped from 2 enemies rather than just 1, making them easier to acquire. Now let's take all the other recipes one at a time, starting with the bullets. Strange as it might sound, the Ichor bullets have a higher base damage and ever so slightly greater velocity. Weird thing that I have found during testing is that it would seem that the Cursed Flame debuff does not actually seem to register in the DPS meter. On the bright side though, we do know that it does 10 damage per second, so whatever our base DPS is, we just add another 10 damage on top of that. While testing, however, I do believe that we find that the Ichor bullets are going to be a better option. With their higher damage and lowering the enemy's defense, they do seem to kill enemies faster. However, I do have to say that Cursed bullets will likely serve you better if you're fighting more enemies, as the extra 10 damage per second for every enemy hit will quickly add up. Even with that said, I'm going to have to give the Ichor bullets a point here. We then see a strange reversal when we get to arrows, with Cursed arrows having greater base damage than the Ichor counterpart. Ichor still has greater velocity for whatever reason, but what happens when we test these arrows out? It would sure seem to me that the Cursed Flames now has a massive advantage over the Ichor ones. With its higher base damage and the fact that it does a lot more damage over time, it's going to be far more effective than lowering the defense of your target, and therefore, cursed arrows are better than Ichor arrows. And to my absolute amazement, when we get to Flask, Cursed Flask, and Ichor Flask, it would seem to me that the Cursed Flasks are actually a lot more helpful. The main reason being that you are asking for either lower defense or 10 flat damage per second. And although lowering defense of a single target could be better than an extra 10 DPS, Cursed Flames quickly is going to take over the Ichor debuff anytime that there is a group of enemies. And even to single targets, it would seem to me in my testing that Cursed Flames Flask is more helpful. I feel weird saying this, and I feel like it shouldn't actually be this way. Maybe I did the testing wrong, but it would seem to me that the Cursed Flame Flask is better. Now we'll skip over living fire blocks and torches, but before we reach the darts, you'll notice that Cursed Flames have one more recipe than Ichor, allowing you to craft Cursed Flame Flares for some reason, so point to the corruption. But right after that flare brings us to darts. There might be some more discussion to be had with these, but cursed darts prove themselves far superior, not because the debuff they inflict, but how they are used. Cursed darts are best utilized when shot over the target, allowing cursed droppings to rain down on your foes. This gives you the ability to stack a lot of damage while also working well shot directly at your enemies. Cursed darts work wonders against the mech bosses, while Ichor darts are just sort of okay. They are shot in a shotgun spread, with 2 being roughly straight and 2 angled way out to the sides for some reason. These darts almost never hit anything, making them a moot point, and the 2 that are shot aren't exactly dealing an insane amount of damage. If ever given the choice, I'm picking the Destroyer Shredding Cursed Darts. Finally, we come to the Cursed Flames and Golden Shower Mage Weapons, which is not nearly as clear-cut as you might think. The Cursed Flames are almost double the base damage of the Golden Shower, while strangely enough, being ever so slightly faster than the Golden Shower. It does cost 2 more mana per shot, however. In testing, I found that the Cursed Flames, when relegated to only a few targets, will outperform the Golden Shower every time, leaving it in its dust against single targets. It's when the number of enemies goes up that the Golden Shower truly shines, with it being able to pierce a lot more enemies. The question then becomes, how often do you find yourself fighting enough enemies simultaneously that the Golden Shower could overshadow the Cursed Flames? Well, when it comes to the mechs, the Golden Shower would apparently only work better against the Destroyer and its many segments, or at least that's what I would say if it wasn't for the fact that the Cursed Flames will have a significantly more difficult time hitting your targets. The Golden Shower has a very fast velocity and decent range, allowing you to reliably hit the 2 flying mechs, while the Cursed Flames requires gravity to be on your side. The Golden Shower also gives you the benefit of inflicting the Ichor debuff, so you can use the Golden Shower as a secondary to lower the boss's defense. This gives the Golden Shower a use all the way up to Moonlord for the mage. The Cursed Flames could also be used as a debuff weapon, but due to its lack of range and slow projectiles, it's most often more beneficial to simply use primarily as a main weapon. And so the Golden Shower defeats the Cursed Flames, giving the Crimson another point. And that is everything, right? I'm not sure there is anything else that can be covered in this video. I was also expecting the 2 to be close, but I'm really surprised by the results. Assuming I am correct about everything, and you better believe I am a Terraria YouTuber after all. But the 2 world evils are incredibly well balanced, which just speaks volumes as to how well the Relogic team assembled the Crimson in particular, complementing it perfectly with a corruption to make a counterpart that could be truly viewed as better than the original if your opinion is ever so slightly different on a few of my own. But in the end, I think we can confidently say that the corruption is the better world evil. But let me know what you think in the comments below, whether I am wildly wrong about some of these or if you agree wholeheartedly, which you should. But whatever the case, thank you for watching.